Edward Stanton built his life on control, precision, and power. He never let anything disrupt his plans, until a small hand gripped his wrist in the middle of a crowded airport. He looked down and met a pair of wide blue eyes, not just filled with confusion, but fear. "Please," the girl whispered. "Don't let go." For the first time in his life, Edward had no idea what to do next. Edward Stanton had never been a man who believed in fate. His life was built on discipline, precision, and careful planning, where every decision was calculated to bring him success. The airport was just another stop in his well-structured life, a transition point between one destination and another, a place where people came and went without a second thought. He walked through the terminal with his usual air of confidence, his mind already focused on the week ahead. A private jet awaited him on the tarmac, ready to take him to Europe for a long-overdue vacation. It wasn't that he needed the time off, Edward never needed a break, but his assistants had insisted, reminding him that even the most powerful executives required rest. He had agreed, if only to silence their concerns. As he approached the security checkpoint, his phone buzzed in his hand. He glanced down at the screen, scanning through the latest market reports. Everything was as expected, numbers rising exactly as he had predicted. A deal he had been working on for months was set to finalize, and by the time he landed in Paris, another acquisition would be secured. Everything was under control. Until it wasn't. A small hand suddenly grabbed his wrist, firm but trembling. He tensed instinctively, his body going rigid at the unexpected contact. Edward was not a man accustomed to being touched without permission. His head snapped up, prepared to pull away, to demand an explanation, but the words never left his lips. A little girl stood before him. She couldn't have been older than 6. Her straight blonde hair fell just past her shoulders, slightly disheveled as if she had been running. Her bright blue eyes that mirrored his own, were wide with fear, her lips slightly parted as though she had meant to say something but had lost the courage at the last second. Edward frowned, glancing around. The airport was crowded, filled with families, business travelers, and tourists, yet no one seemed to notice her. There were no frantic parents searching nearby, no security officers rushing over to assist. She was alone. He looked back down at her, forcing himself to soften his voice. "Are you lost?" The girl tightened her grip on his wrist, her small fingers pressing against his skin. "Please," she whispered. "Help me." Edward's breath hitched, something unfamiliar twisting in his chest. He had handled hostile negotiations, multi-million-dollar mergers, and the collapse of entire companies without blinking an eye. Yet, standing here, looking into the desperate gaze of a child, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Uncertainty. He crouched slightly, lowering himself to her level, careful not to make any sudden movements. "Where are your parents?" The girl shook her head, her blonde hair falling into her face. "I don't know." Edward studied her carefully. There was no hysterical crying, no panicked wailing for her mother or father. Just fear. Quiet, controlled fear, as if she understood far more than a child her age should. "What's your name?" he asked. For the first time, she hesitated. Her brow furrowed slightly, her lips pressing together, as if she were trying to remember. Then, almost too quietly, she whispered, "I don't know." Edward's pulse quickened. "You don't know your own name?" She shook her head again, her small fingers still clinging to his wrist. Something was wrong. This wasn't just a lost child wandering away from her parents. This was something else. Edward had planned every detail of his day, from the moment he left his penthouse to the second he would board his plane. But nowhere in those carefully laid out plans had he accounted for this. He exhaled slowly, adjusting his cuff with his free hand. "All right," he said, his voice steady. "We'll figure this out." The girl's grip tightened for just a second before loosening slightly, as if his words had given her the smallest amount of reassurance. Edward Stanton had never believed in fate. But standing there, with a lost child holding onto him like he was her last hope, he had a feeling his life was about to change in ways he could have never anticipated. Edward Stanton had never been the kind of man to hesitate. His life was structured around quick, decisive action. Every deal he closed, every negotiation he entered, every calculated risk he took had been built on the certainty that hesitation led to failure. Yet, standing in the middle of a crowded airport with a little girl gripping his wrist like a lifeline, he found himself frozen, unsure of his next move for the first time in years. The girl was small, fragile-looking but composed in a way that didn't seem natural for a child her age. She wasn't crying, wasn't calling out for her parents, wasn't even looking around in search of someone familiar. Instead, she stood still, holding on to him with quiet determination, as if she had already decided that he was her only chance. Edward forced himself to think logically. The first step was security. They would have a protocol for lost children, a system in place to locate her parents or guardians. It was the simplest, most rational solution. Yet, when he started to move in the direction of the nearest security checkpoint, the girl pulled back. Her grip on his wrist tightened, her small fingers pressing into his skin with surprising strength. "No," she whispered. Edward stopped, glancing down at her. "They can help find your family," he said, keeping his voice calm. She shook her head, her blonde hair shifting slightly with the movement. "No. Please. Not them." Something in her voice, something raw and urgent, made him pause. He studied her, searching her face for answers she wasn't giving him. "Why not?" She looked around then, scanning the crowd with wide, wary eyes, her fingers still locked around his wrist. When she turned back to him, her voice was barely audible. "I don't think they're looking for me." Edward's stomach tightened. "Your parents?" he asked carefully. She hesitated for a fraction of a second before shaking her head. "The people I was with." He narrowed his eyes. "Who were they?" She opened her mouth as if to answer, then quickly closed it, her entire body tensing. It was as if something had shifted in her mind, some warning that had been ingrained deep inside her, stopping her from saying too much. Edward exhaled slowly, adjusting the cuff of his tailored jacket with his free hand, more out of habit than necessity. "All right," he said, lowering his voice just enough to make it clear he wasn't going to push her, yet. "Then what do you want me to do?" The girl swallowed hard, her grip on him unwavering. "Don't let go." Edward wasn't sure why those words settled so heavily in his chest. He had spent his life keeping people at arm's length, maintaining a distance between himself and anything that resembled vulnerability. Even as a child, he had learned that attachment was a liability, that emotions were unpredictable and dangerous. He had built walls around himself that no one had ever broken through. And yet, here was this little girl, asking him for something so simple, something he had never given to anyone, his presence, his protection. He exhaled and nodded. "Okay." Her shoulders relaxed just slightly, enough for him to realize just how much she had been bracing herself for rejection. He glanced around the terminal, his mind working through his next steps. He couldn't just stand there with her indefinitely, but he also couldn't ignore the way she flinched at the thought of being taken by security. If she was afraid of the people who were supposed to be looking for her, that meant something was very wrong. He pulled out his phone, scrolling through his contacts before tapping on a number. The call rang twice before a familiar voice answered. "Sir." "James," Edward said, his tone brisk. "I need you to meet me at the airport immediately. Something's come up." His assistant didn't question him. "Right away." Edward ended the call and looked down at the girl. "We're going to figure this out. But I need you to trust me." She studied him for a long moment before nodding. "I do." Edward wasn't sure why that one small sentence settled something inside him. But he knew one thing for certain, he wasn't letting her go. Edward stood with the little girl in the middle of the airport terminal, his mind racing through every possible scenario. The logical part of him knew the easiest course of action would be to hand her over to airport security, let them handle the situation, and board his flight as planned. That was what any reasonable person would do. That was what made sense. But something about her hesitation, about the way she had gripped his wrist and refused to let go, about the quiet fear in her bright blue eyes, told him that this wasn't a simple case of a lost child waiting to be reunited with her family. He had spent years making fast, efficient decisions that benefited his business. But this wasn't a business deal. This was a 6-year-old girl, standing beside him, clutching his sleeve like he was the only thing keeping her grounded. She didn't speak as they stood there, watching the flow of people around them. Her fingers had loosened slightly, but she hadn't let go of his hand. Edward glanced down at her. "Are you sure you don't remember anything?" She hesitated, her lips pressing together as if she was trying to force the words out. After a long moment, she shook her head. "I don't know," she whispered. "I think I do. But it's not all there." Edward frowned. He had heard of trauma-induced memory loss before. He had read about it in passing, in reports about cases where people had blocked out certain events after experiencing something too overwhelming to process. But he had never seen it firsthand. He crouched down slightly, keeping his voice calm. "Think about the last thing you do remember. Where were you?" The girl's eyebrows furrowed, and she lowered her gaze to the floor. "I was in a car." Edward's jaw tightened. "With who?" She took a breath, her little hands balling into fists at her sides. "A man and a woman. But not my mom. Not my dad." His pulse quickened slightly. "Did they say anything to you?" She nodded, gripping the hem of her shirt. "They said to be quiet. That I had to wait. And that someone would come for me." Edward exhaled slowly, keeping his expression neutral, though every instinct in him told him this was worse than he had originally thought. A child who had been with people who weren't her parents, who had been told to wait for someone, who had been left in the middle of an airport with no memory of how she got there. This wasn't just a lost child. This was something else entirely. Before he could say anything, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, glancing at the name on the screen. "James." He answered immediately. "Tell me you're here." "Just pulled up," his assistant replied. "Where are you?" "Gate C, near the security checkpoint." "I'll be there in 2 minutes." Edward ended the call and looked back at the girl. "Someone I trust is coming. He'll help us figure this out." She nodded but didn't say anything. True to his word, James arrived within minutes, his sharp eyes scanning the scene before landing on Edward and the girl. He was a man who was used to dealing with high-pressure situations, accustomed to handling last-minute changes in plans and executing solutions with precision. But even James hesitated for a fraction of a second when he saw the child standing beside Edward, holding onto his sleeve like she belonged there. "Sir," James greeted, his tone level but questioning. Edward straightened. "We have a situation." James's gaze flickered between him and the girl, assessing. "I see that. Who is she?" "That's what we're going to find out." James nodded, his mind already working through possibilities. "We could have security check the cameras, see who she came in with." Edward shook his head. "She doesn't want to go to security. And based on what she's told me, I'm not sure I trust whoever brought her here to be looking for her." James absorbed this information quickly, then turned to the girl, softening his usually professional demeanor. "What's your name?" The girl hesitated, glancing at Edward before answering. "I don't remember." James didn't react outwardly, but Edward knew him well enough to catch the small shift in his expression. "All right," James said carefully. "What's the plan?" Edward glanced down at the girl, then back at James. "We take her with us." James blinked, clearly not expecting that answer. "Sir, you're supposed to be on a flight in 2 hours." Edward exhaled, glancing at his watch. That flight, that trip, suddenly felt completely insignificant. "Cancel it," he said. James didn't question him further. He simply pulled out his phone and started making the necessary calls. Edward looked back down at the girl. "We're going somewhere safe." She studied him for a long moment before nodding. And just like that, his entire life shifted. For the first time in years, he was walking away from a meticulously planned schedule, stepping into something completely unknown. And for the first time in as long as he could remember, he didn't regret it. Edward had never brought anyone to his penthouse before. His home was a space designed for efficiency, not comfort, built for a man who had no time for unnecessary distractions. Everything inside it was curated, minimalist furniture, clean lines, neutral colors. It was a place where he could think, work, and exist without the chaos of the outside world interrupting him. But now, as he stepped inside with the little girl still holding onto his sleeve, he realized just how empty it truly was. She hesitated at the entrance, her small frame still tense, her blue eyes scanning the space with caution. She wasn't like most children her age, there was no wide-eyed curiosity, no immediate interest in exploring. Instead, she stood stiffly, as if afraid that stepping further inside would mean she was intruding. Edward turned to James, who had followed them in, already scanning the room like the well-trained problem solver he was. He wasn't just an assistant, he was the closest thing Edward had to a right hand, someone who had handled crises far beyond missed meetings and last-minute travel changes. "We need information," Edward said, his voice level. "No one just abandons a child in an airport without a reason." James nodded, already pulling out his phone. "I'll start with private investigators. Someone has to be looking for her." Edward glanced down at the girl, her grip on his sleeve having loosened but not fully released. "Are you hungry?" She hesitated for a second before nodding. He wasn't used to asking those kinds of questions, let alone figuring out how to accommodate a child. His kitchen was rarely used, stocked mostly with high-end coffee, protein bars, and the occasional meal prepared by his staff when he worked late. He walked toward the fridge, opening it to scan what was inside, before realizing that nothing in there was suitable for a 6-year-old. Without missing a beat, James took over. "I'll have food delivered." Edward nodded, grateful for the quick solution. The girl stood by the large windows now, looking out at the city skyline. The view from his penthouse was something most people would admire, floor-to-ceiling glass that showcased the sprawling lights of downtown, the pulse of a city that never truly slept. But she didn't seem fascinated by it. She just stared, as if trying to piece together where she was and what came next. He walked over to her, standing at a slight distance so as not to overwhelm her. "Do you remember anything?" She shifted slightly, her small hands gripping the hem of her shirt. "I remember being in a car," she murmured. "It was dark." Edward studied her carefully. "Was there anyone with you?" She hesitated, then nodded. "A man and a woman. But they weren't my parents." His jaw tightened. "Did they say anything to you?" Her blue eyes flickered toward him, filled with something he didn't like seeing in a child, fear mixed with uncertainty, as if she was debating whether she should tell him. Finally, she whispered, "They told me to be quiet. That I had to wait for someone to come." Edward inhaled slowly, forcing himself to stay calm. "And then they left you at the airport?" She nodded. James, who had been listening, lowered his phone slightly. "That doesn't sound like a random abandonment," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "It sounds planned." Edward already knew that. He turned back to the girl. "Do you remember where they took you before the airport?" She frowned, pressing her lips together as if trying to recall something just out of reach. "A hotel, I think. The windows had curtains that didn't open." Edward exchanged a glance with James, who was already taking notes. "That narrows it down," James muttered. "I'll check nearby hotels near the airport." The girl's gaze dropped to the floor, her hands tightening around the fabric of her shirt again. Edward watched her carefully. "Do you remember your name?" She hesitated longer this time. For a second, he thought she might not answer at all. But then, so softly he almost didn't hear it, she whispered, "Lily." It wasn't much. But it was something. Edward knelt slightly so he could meet her gaze. "All right, Lily," he said, his voice steady. "Until we figure out who you belong to, you're staying here." Her eyes widened slightly, as if she hadn't expected that answer. James glanced at him but didn't argue. Lily's small fingers tightened around the hem of her shirt again. "You won't leave me?" The question hit him harder than he anticipated. Edward exhaled slowly. "No," he said simply. "I won't." Lily studied him for a long moment before finally relaxing her shoulders just a little. It wasn't trust. Not yet. But it was the first step. Edward had never been a man who second-guessed himself. Every decision he made was deliberate, every move calculated. But as he stood in his penthouse, watching a 6-year-old girl quietly nibble on a sandwich at his kitchen counter, he realized that this was the first situation in a long time where he had no clear strategy. Lily hadn't said much since she arrived. She ate cautiously, her small hands gripping the sandwich carefully, as if she was still waiting for someone to take it away. Edward noticed how she sat stiffly, her posture too controlled for a child her age, her blue eyes darting around the room like she was still trying to decide if this place was safe. He had seen the same behavior in boardrooms, in negotiations where people sat across from him, unsure of how much they could trust the man on the other side of the table. But this wasn't business. This was a little girl who had been abandoned at an airport, with no memory of her last name, no idea who had left her there, and no one coming to claim her. James stood a few feet away, his phone in hand as he went through the latest updates from the private investigators Edward had hired. "No reports of a missing child matching her description," he said, his voice low but sharp with concern. "No one's filed anything, no alerts, nothing in the databases." Edward frowned. "That doesn't make sense. Someone had to bring her there. Someone should be looking for her." James nodded, scrolling through his notes. "There was security footage from the airport. We're still reviewing it, but the initial report says she wasn't dropped off at the main entrance. They think she was left inside near the departure gates. No record of anyone reporting a lost child, no adults seen looking for her." Edward's grip tightened around his coffee cup. "So they left her there deliberately?" James hesitated before nodding. "It looks that way." Edward exhaled slowly, forcing himself to stay calm. He had spent years building an empire where problems were solved with ruthless efficiency. This wasn't something he could fix with a well-placed call or a carefully negotiated deal. This was a child, alone and abandoned, and the more he learned, the worse it got. Lily had finished eating, setting the plate down with quiet precision. She glanced up at him, as if waiting to see what would happen next. He leaned against the counter, keeping his voice even. "How do you feel?" She hesitated before answering. "Better." "Good," he said. "You can stay here for now. Until we figure this out." She studied him for a long moment. "But what if no one comes for me?" Edward felt something tighten in his chest. She wasn't just asking for reassurance, she was preparing for the possibility that she had been left behind for good. He didn't know what to say to that, didn't know how to promise something he wasn't sure of. But he did know one thing. "If that happens," he said carefully, "we'll figure out something else. You're not alone in this." Lily nodded, but the way she lowered her gaze told him she wasn't sure if she could believe him yet. James cleared his throat slightly, checking his watch. "I'll keep pressing our sources. In the meantime, what do you want me to do about?" He gestured slightly toward Lily, leaving the rest unsaid. Edward understood the question. What was the plan? What came next? He had no idea. But looking at the girl sitting quietly in his kitchen, he knew one thing for certain. She wasn't going anywhere. The next morning, Edward woke earlier than usual. His internal clock was tuned to business meetings, early flights, and high-stakes negotiations, but today was different. His mind wasn't on work, wasn't on the upcoming deals that his company was finalizing. Instead, it was on the small girl who had fallen asleep in the guest room down the hall. He had checked on her late last night, standing in the doorway for longer than he cared to admit. She had curled up beneath the heavy blankets, her small frame barely taking up space in the large bed. Her breathing had been even, but her hand had remained tightly wrapped around the fabric of her pillow, as if bracing herself for something. Now, as he stood in the kitchen, brewing his usual black coffee, he realized he had no idea how to start a morning with a child in his house. He was a man of strict routine, built around efficiency. Breakfast was something that happened on the go, usually prepared by his house staff or eaten at the office between meetings. But now, with Lily here, that wasn't going to work. James arrived just as Edward was staring at the fridge, realizing that nothing inside it was remotely appropriate for a 6-year-old. His assistant stepped into the kitchen, pausing briefly before raising an eyebrow. "You're making breakfast?" James asked, amusement clear in his tone. Edward exhaled, closing the fridge door. "I was considering it." James smirked. "And? There's nothing here she'll eat." James nodded, already pulling out his phone. "I'll have something delivered." Edward appreciated the efficiency, but something about it didn't sit right. The girl had been left alone at an airport, abandoned without an explanation. The least he could do was make sure she felt safe now. "Cancel it," he said, rolling up the sleeves of his dress shirt. "I'll do it myself." James didn't argue, but his smirk deepened. "This I have to see." Edward ignored him and focused on the task at hand. He found eggs and bread, something simple enough to work with. As he moved through the kitchen, cracking eggs into a pan, he caught James watching him like he was witnessing something unbelievable. "Don't you have something more productive to do?" Edward muttered. James leaned against the counter, crossing his arms. "This is the most productive thing I've seen you do in years." Before Edward could respond, soft footsteps echoed from the hallway. Lily appeared at the edge of the kitchen, still in the oversized t-shirt James had brought for her last night. Her blonde hair was slightly messy from sleep, and she hesitated in the doorway, as if unsure if she was allowed to step inside. Edward turned to her, gesturing toward the kitchen table. "Sit. Breakfast is almost ready." She blinked, her blue eyes flicking between him and James before cautiously making her way to a chair. She sat quietly, her hands resting in her lap, watching as he finished cooking. When he placed a plate in front of her, she looked down at it for a moment, her small fingers lightly gripping the edge. She took a careful bite, chewing thoughtfully before glancing up at him. "You made this?" she asked, as if the idea was almost impossible. Edward nodded. "Yes." She hesitated, then took another bite. "It's not bad." James snorted, and Edward shot him a warning glance before turning his attention back to Lily. "You can tell me if you don't like something," he said, watching her carefully. "You don't have to be polite." Lily shrugged. "I do like it." She took another bite, slower this time. "I just don't remember the last time someone made breakfast for me." Edward felt something shift in his chest, a quiet ache he didn't want to acknowledge. He didn't push for more information. Instead, he sat down across from her, his own plate untouched as he watched her eat. James cleared his throat, checking his phone. "Our people are still looking into any missing persons cases. No updates yet." Lily's shoulders tensed slightly at the mention of missing persons, but she didn't say anything. Edward exhaled. "We'll figure it out." Lily glanced up at him, her blue eyes cautious but searching. "And if you don't?" He didn't hesitate. "Then you stay here." She stared at him for a long moment before nodding slowly. She didn't say thank you. She didn't smile. But for the first time, she looked just a little less afraid. Edward had never been the type of man to second-guess his decisions. He built an empire on certainty, on knowing the outcome before he even made a move. But as he sat in his office later that morning, reviewing documents on his laptop, he found his thoughts drifting away from work, something that rarely, if ever, happened. Lily was in the next room, where James had set up a quiet space for her with books, puzzles, and a small television. She hadn't asked for anything, hadn't complained, hadn't made a sound since she finished breakfast. That was what unsettled him the most. Most children would have been asking questions by now, demanding to know what was going to happen next, clinging to whatever adult was closest in search of comfort. But Lily simply existed in silence, as if she was trying not to take up space, as if she had already learned that asking for things led to disappointment. Edward exhaled, closing his laptop. He wasn't the type to ignore problems, and this, whatever this was, wasn't something he could afford to push aside. He stood, walking to the adjoining room where Lily was sitting cross-legged on the couch, flipping absently through the pages of a book she wasn't really reading. She looked up as he entered, her expression neutral but guarded, as if preparing herself for something. He leaned against the doorway, arms crossed. "What do you usually do during the day?" She blinked, as if the question had surprised her. "I don't know." "You don't know?" She hesitated, fingers pressing lightly against the edge of the book. "I move around a lot. I don't always get to do the same things." Something cold settled in Edward's chest. "You move around a lot." She nodded. "We never stayed anywhere for too long." His jaw tightened, but he kept his voice steady. "Who was we?" Lily's small fingers gripped the book a little tighter. "My mom." Edward waited, but she didn't say anything else. He chose his next words carefully. "And the people who left you at the airport?" For the first time, something flickered in her expression. A brief flash of something he couldn't quite place, fear, maybe, or uncertainty. She looked down at the book, running her fingers over the page before answering. "They weren't my mom." Edward exhaled slowly, pushing away the frustration he felt building inside him. He didn't want to press her, didn't want to force something she wasn't ready to say. But every piece of information she gave him only confirmed what he already suspected: this was bigger than just a lost child. He walked over and sat in the chair across from her, keeping enough distance to make sure she didn't feel trapped. "We're going to figure this out," he said, his voice calm but firm. "But until then, I need you to tell me if anything doesn't feel right. If you remember something important. If you feel scared." Lily looked at him for a long moment, as if weighing whether or not she believed him. Finally, she gave a small nod. "Okay." Edward studied her for a second longer before nodding in return. "Good." She went back to flipping through the book, her posture a little more relaxed than before. As he stood to leave, she suddenly spoke again. "Are you going back to work now?" Edward paused, glancing at her. "I was." Lily tilted her head slightly, considering that. "You don't have to stay with me all the time. I can be quiet." Edward let out a breath, rubbing the back of his neck. "That's not the point." She watched him carefully. "Then what is the point?" He hesitated for a second before answering. "You're not something I can just ignore, Lily." She didn't say anything, but something in her expression shifted, just slightly, just enough for him to see it. It wasn't trust, not yet. But maybe, for the first time, it was the beginning of something close. That evening, Edward found himself doing something he never thought he would, adjusting his entire schedule for someone else. His life had always been dictated by structure, by efficiency, by the next deal, the next acquisition, the next step in expanding his empire. He had never let anything interfere with that. But now, there was a 6-year-old girl in his home, sitting at his kitchen table, stirring a spoon absent-mindedly in a bowl of soup she had barely touched. She wasn't refusing to eat, but she wasn't really engaging with the meal either. She seemed lost in thought, her blue eyes flicking to the large windows that overlooked the glowing city skyline. Edward sat across from her, watching carefully. He had spent years reading people, knowing when they were lying, when they were holding something back, when they were about to make a move that would change the course of a negotiation. But Lily wasn't a business deal, and that made her harder to read. He took a sip of his own drink before speaking. "You don't like the soup?" She shook her head, barely lifting her spoon. "It's fine." That didn't answer the question. She hesitated, then shrugged. "I'm just not really hungry." Edward set his glass down. "Because of everything that's going on?" Lily looked at him for a moment, then nodded. He leaned back slightly, considering his next words. "Do you want to talk about it?" She hesitated again, but this time, she didn't shake her head. That was progress. She looked down at her spoon, stirring the liquid again. "I don't know what's supposed to happen next." Edward exhaled, running a hand through his hair. He understood that feeling better than she probably realized. He had built his entire life on knowing what came next, but this was unfamiliar territory for both of them. "What do you want to happen next?" he asked. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she tapped her spoon against the side of the bowl, thinking. "I want to know where my mom is," she finally said. Edward nodded, his chest tightening slightly. That was the one thing he couldn't give her, not yet. "I want to know if she's okay," Lily added quietly. "And if she's not, I want to know why she didn't come for me." Her voice was steady, but Edward could hear the uncertainty beneath it, the way she was trying not to sound as scared as she really was. He leaned forward slightly. "James is still looking. He's using every resource we have to find her. But until we do, I don't want you to worry about what-ifs. We'll figure it out when we get there." Lily looked up at him, searching his face for something. "And what if we never do?" Edward didn't answer right away. He knew better than to make promises he wasn't sure he could keep. But what he could promise was that she wouldn't go through this alone. "Then we deal with that, too," he said firmly. Lily studied him, her blue eyes unreadable, but there was something in her posture that relaxed just slightly. She picked up her spoon and took a small bite of the soup. Edward didn't say anything, didn't push for more conversation. But he stayed seated across from her until she had finished. That night, after she had gone to bed, he found himself standing outside her room, staring at the closed door longer than necessary. For the first time in his life, his priorities had shifted. And he didn't regret it. This story is more than just a tale of a powerful man whose life is disrupted by an unexpected responsibility. It's about transformation, about how even the most controlled and structured lives can be unraveled by something as simple, and as profound, as human connection. Edward Stanton begins as a man defined by power, wealth, and a strict sense of order. He has spent years building an empire, making decisions with ruthless efficiency, and ensuring that nothing and no one can shake his carefully constructed world. But when Lily enters his life, everything changes. What makes this story compelling is not just the mystery surrounding Lily, who she is, where she came from, and why she was abandoned, but the way she forces Edward to confront something he has never faced before, responsibility that cannot be delegated, controlled, or reasoned away. For the first time, he is faced with a problem that doesn't have a strategic solution, only a human one. The ending is powerful not because Edward suddenly becomes a perfect father figure overnight, but because he chooses to stay. He chooses to be there, to be someone Lily can rely on, even when the answers about her past remain uncertain. The true resolution isn't just in finding out what happened to Lily's mother or uncovering the truth about her past, it's in the bond that grows between them, in the moment Lily finally starts to believe she is safe, and in the realization that Edward, for all his success, was missing something far greater than he ever understood. This is a story about change, about how sometimes the most unexpected people enter our lives and turn everything upside down, forcing us to see what truly matters. Edward thought he had everything, but in the end, it wasn't his wealth or his power that defined him. It was the simple act of holding on when someone needed him the most. And that, more than anything, made him the man he was always meant to be.